launched in March. And a key part of that was about improving the experience for girls and increasing the role that women and girls have in our sport. We keep hearing about a challenging culture that sometimes exists and about different barriers for women and girls partaking. Also, not least, the lack of females in leadership positions in clubs. For example, less than 10% of club commodores are female. Another example would be that we've had 7 male Olympians from Northern Ireland, and there's never been a female Northern Irish Olympian in sailing, which is something that we want to change. So this research, we wanted real lived experiences in the sport that were uncensored, hence contracting or commissioning Emma Vickers, an independent researcher who's done a brilliant job. This research is brilliant, depressing, not entirely different from what we thought it might be, but there's some fantastic recommendations. And I think it'll be really good to kick off a discussion in clubs about the challenges. So over to you, Emma. You could introduce yourself a bit better than I did, maybe.
Brilliant. No, thank you. Thanks, Mary. Hopefully you can all see the screen okay now. So yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to first of all do the research. It was a really insightful process. I really enjoyed being part of it, and obviously good to sort of present some of the results to you in this evening. So yeah, so my name's Emma. I'm currently the head of pathway development at Table Tennis England. So table tennis is my sport, it's my background, it's the sport that I played. But my sort of work background prior to that was in research. So I worked as a bit of insight for an organisation connected with Sport England, and yeah, conducted lots of research with sort of about 25 different sports, and women and girls is one of the topic areas I've sort of focused on within that work. So I've done some projects with lots of different sports. Yeah, I have no connection with sailing. I have actually never sailed, so that's something I still need to get involved in as well with. So yeah, hopefully a nice sort of impartial perspective, which I think is quite sort of nice and refreshing sometimes with these projects, for someone to come in that's had no sort of prior history with what's been happening. So I will introduce the research to you very shortly. Yeah, I suppose really what I'm going to be talking to you tonight is just a summary of predominantly the sort of barriers that emerged for females in the sport. There was lots of other topic areas that we discussed. So we looked at various things around sort of facilitators for females, a little bit around competition, some around pathway. But predominantly what I will look at today is barriers, and then a very brief summary of some of the recommendations at the end for you to consider and maybe take away for your clubs. So just as a brief sort of introduction, the work. So the in sort of late, I think it was about late 2022, it's probably around December. Northern Ireland approached me, so it's with Greg. So I previously worked with Greg at Tennis England, so I knew him very well. So I want to take this project centered on women and girls' experiences, the barriers they face, and also the facilitators, so what motivates them as well to engage in the sailing within Northern Ireland. So as Mary's introduced really well in the sort of introduction there, what was sort of presented to me was that there was about a third females compared to males currently members of the Northern Ireland sailing, which actually is quite a bit higher than some sports. So if we look at that from a table tennis perspective, I think it's currently about 12% membership for females, so significantly lower. However, that doesn't resonate necessarily into sort of wider aspects of the sport. So as sort of mentioned by Mary there at the start, around sort of commodores and aspects around governance and also work-based roles as well. So yeah, the overarching aims, you can see just some of the bullet points on the slide here. So to really understand the barriers around why females drop out, and to understand women and girls' motivations across different levels of the sport. So we looked at So girls and women who were involved at a very social level, to those who were also involved at quite a high sort of senior international level as well. And we really want to understand what would enable more women and girls to either start, so get into the sport, continue their participation, compete in more events, and possibly do a career in the sport as well. So yeah, there was a number of different aims, but as I said, today really is just going to focus on the barriers and then just give you a very brief summary of the recommendations, give you some thoughts and things to consider moving forward. So I think the full report is going to be made available to members. So it is quite a lengthy report. However, it's also quite visual and there's lots of stats and figures and images. So it's quite, I hope, not a difficult read. It's quite a nice read. So hopefully that will give you lots of information. It's got lots of quotes. So it really brings the project to life. So hopefully it's something that you enjoy reading. So research was in two parts. So we started with a survey and we actually had exactly 100 participants. So it's quite a nice figure to end on. So what you'll find in the report is some details around the demographics of that population. And you'll also find lots of stats around sort of age of dropout, age players sort of start sailing. Are they interested in re-engaging if they've dropped out? Types of boats they've sailed in, competitions they've taken part in, engagement in other roles. So yes, there's lots of different stats you'll see in the final report that I'm not going to have time to talk about today. And then part two was focus groups and interviews. So my background is predominantly as a qualitative researcher. So this is sort of the area I sort of really enjoy and sort of thrive in collecting the data. So yeah, you can see obviously on the screen there was different populations that I spoke to. Yeah, really enjoyed having lots of conversations with yourselves. So yeah, although surveys are really can give you some really precise data and good stats, I always find it's, particularly in topics like this, much better to actually have those conversations one-to-one with people who are involved in the sport. So what you'll see one of the first couple of pages in the report is a summary of key findings. So this slides I've obviously done it very, very much condensed. There's a lot more detail in the report itself, but as you can see on the screen there, I'll just briefly summarise what some of those are. So routes into the sport for beginner level adults were deemed to be quite difficult. Many engage in the sport for quite short periods and drop out quite quickly. There was a lot of discussion about how sailing is this sort of family orientated intergenerational sport, which I think is a really, really positive aspect. However, it's not as straightforward for females to enter the sport when they actually have no prior connection. Motives for females to take part in the sport were predominantly intrinsic, so things have challenged themselves internally and were sort of driven within themselves. Females want more opportunities to sail socially without the pressure of racing, but access to boats is quite challenging, so something again I will be picking up on. Lack of visibility of females from all corners of sailing was deemed to be a barrier. And role models very much need to be age, level, and role specific. There was some discussion around big boat sailing and how lots of females were very, very interested in getting into this, but didn't really understand sort of how the pathways to do so. Male dominance in the sport was discussed very, very heavily. And that's again something I will come on to in the next sort of few slides when we look at the barriers. Race officiating is an area that lots of women really wanted to get involved in, but again, weren't quite sure what commitment was involved and sort of what pathways and where they would be able to do this. Lots of females in the pathway squads feel that their opportunities to pursue sailing as a career were quite limited. They sort of found it difficult to foresee what their future could look like long term in the sport. Females are happy to engage in mixed gender sailing, so they very much like taking part in sailing with males. However, what they did want is to take part in sessions and racing that was specific to their level and their experience. So I'll also talk about some of the club environments and the sort of changing facilities. WOW, so Women on Water, was deemed to be a fantastic programme. and a real sort of positive gateway into the sport. However, I think there's now a sort of second phase that maybe could be looked at with that. And the branding, I think, is excellent. So, everyone spoke very positively about their experiences with Women on Water. But what I've done in the recommendations is give some sort of ideas around how it can be progressed again moving forward. So, yeah, these are some of the things I'm going to be talking about. So, before I talk about barriers, which is going to be the focus of today, so half of the report was very much centered on the facilitators. So, it's important to understand what prevents female sailors from taking part in sailing. However, it's equally as important to really understand what supports them to thrive in the sport, what motivates them, why do they keep coming back to sport? Because if we really understand these factors, it can really help us shape programs that we put on for them. So as you can see on the screen, here are just some of the many facilitators for women and girls, why they want to sail. So very much, as I discussed there, it's a sport for life. There was a lot of discussion around how it's intergenerational. You can have sort of, older people sailing with younger people alongside one another. And that's not something that's typical across lots of sports. There was also a lot of discussion around sort of the therapeutic benefits and powers that sailing has, and that sort of power of the ocean, and how it can really be sort of de-stressor and sort of the real positive impact it can have on well-being, and how that for women particularly should be sold as a real benefit of the sport that, again, some sports might not have. If they're indoors, it's not quite the same as being out in the fresh air on the water. So the role of male allies, again, I will probably touch on this a little bit later, but certainly males can have an extremely positive influence on women and their role in the sport and really empower them to sort of push forward and progress. There was some discussion around competition and that sort of positive role of female prizes and how they can really increase the motivation for women, and that was very much seen as a positive for many. There was lots of discussion around how sailing gives young people and adults this sort of transferable skill set in life. So sailing is a very multifactorial sport and can give young girls sort of this huge sense of competency. There's lots of decision making. They have to consider the wind and the weather, make decisions very quickly. And actually that's quite different again to lots of other sports. There's so many different elements there that can transfer into their schoolwork or other work or their sort of general life skills. And again, it's also a conduit to many different careers. And again, that's something that isn't necessarily seen within other sports. So again, women sort of discussed how they really want sessions that are split by the sort of level and experience rather than gender. So actually women-only sessions isn't always that important. And there was lots of discussion about how people really sort of enjoy being with people who are at a similar level to them. Lots of discussions about women on water and sort of the huge impact this has had on people's lives and increase their confidence. People talked about making friends for life. And yeah, had some really, really positive, really nice discussions about that. And I think it's a huge potential to grow that program even more. And then finally, just around that social experience. So again, this is something lots of women spoke about, lots of girls spoke about, having friends all over Northern Ireland, all over the world in some cases. And yeah, I think sport is a really powerful tool for that, and particularly for females, that social element carries sometimes a lot more weight than it does for males. So yeah, that is just a very, very brief summary of some of the facilitators. So what you'll see in the report is all of this discussed and detailed and quotes and lots more sort of stuff and graphs around this. So yeah, hopefully it's good to talk about some of those real positives before we sort of focus on maybe some of the barriers and challenges that females did face within the sport. So I've just snipped sort of a couple of bits out here from the survey. So just to give you a very brief indication around when females actually did drop out. So using the survey, I was able to sort of figure out when women dropped out and whether that varied depending on their level. So exit from sailing really did vary, and sailors who were at different levels in the sport. So what we saw is that the more elite and sort of experienced internationally a sailor became, actually the longer they stay in the sport for. And actually that's quite interesting because that is in complete contrast to table tennis, for example, and other sports, which suggested in the research that I've done, actually the more elite someone becomes, actually it can lead them to drop out earlier. So I thought that was quite interesting, sort of the difference there from other sports. And as you can see from that sort of stat on the screen there, only a very small percentage of those that had dropped out had sailed at international levels. So again, suggesting that opportunities for real beginner or intermediate level sailors may be less accessible and maybe with the fewer connections they have sort of from a family perspective as well. So again, some quite interesting stats there. When I asked if females were interested in re-engaging in the sport in the future, they had dropped out. It was 83% that said that they were. So by all accounts, that's quite a good high sort of stat. So lots of women do want to start sailing again. And when we asked them, how, why, what would support you to get involved again, certainly that's the most popular option by some way was to sort of sail with other females at the same level as them on a social basis. So again, not just with other females, but really at the same sort of level and experience as them. More opportunities to be coached, that was discussed quite regularly, more initiatives led by RYA Northern Ireland, opportunities to hire a boat, and a change in the culture of the sport. So more value and respect for women and girls taking part within sailing. So yeah, as you can see, there's some reasons on the slide there around the exits of female sailors, but I won't go into those in detail because I'm going to be doing that on the next sort of couple of slides. Okay, so as discussed at the start, so the real focus is going to be this evening around the barriers for females to engage in sailing. So it's important to recognise that the barriers outlined here were not the experience of all sailors, and every sailor's experience is very different. It's just sort of some commonalities and themes that were picked up depending on different environments that they sit within. Many of the people I spoke to outlined, how they dropped out of sailing was basically like an accumulation of lots of different things, lots of bad experiences, different bits here and there. I not necessarily have, a main reason why they had dropped out. So for me, that really suggests that, small improvements could be made in different aspects in club environments, some bits with initiatives from the governing body, then that can make a real big difference to sort of female participation. So I will discuss now some of those barriers that emerged. So I guess one of the main ones I think that came out was really just not being from the sport. And as I mentioned, sort of some of the previous slides there, so when you don't have connections from a family perspective, it was very difficult for people, particularly when they were at the very social level. They often described feeling sort of somewhat undervalued or maybe not feeling quite welcome if they didn't have that sailing background. And many of the sort of females took part in the who discussed how they grew up in a sport and it made it quite easy to dip in and out because they always had those connections throughout their lives. However, those that come into sport, particularly as an adult beginner with no prior involvement, they felt somewhat like they've been thrown into the deep end in some cases, maybe not given enough time or respect to learn at the pace that they need to go at. And there certainly needs to be this need for an increased focus on sort of adult beginners and maybe more extensive learning opportunities. So obviously sailing is a very complex sport and takes a lot of time to build that competency. And there was also difficulties entering the sport for females, particularly when they were single. They didn't have another half to come with and support, and particularly with the logistics of sailing as well, it'd be quite difficult with all the equipment. So certainly that was an aspect as well that lots of women spoke about, and maybe being assigned sort of club buddy to support that initiation period could really be quite impactful for sort of solo female adult beginners. So secondly, around kind of links actually to the first point, that there was a lot of discussion around how females felt that the opportunities for, again, adult female beginners were far less than sailors who were maybe slightly more advanced or children. So as I discussed, unlike sailors that have grown up in the sport and have sailed with parents as children, have sort of built up that competency, adult beginners need much more time to develop confidence on the water. It can be quite a daunting aspect if you've never done it before. And so female sailors spoke about wanting more intensive training opportunities over longer periods of time. So really build up those skills in a sort of safe, friendly, sort of no pressure environment. So yeah, they're kind of some of the first points to sort of raise around the barriers. Secondly, there was sort of a discussion around how it's quite difficult to hire a boat, and that can be a big barrier for many women. So looking at the sort of, I think it's 24% of female sailors that didn't own a boat or have shared ownership of a boat. Many of them had actually also dropped out. So again, shows it's quite difficult to keep sailing when there's quite limited access to equipment. So some of the points that were raised around boat ownership included things like if you're new to sailing and you don't know someone with a boat, it's kind of a bit of a non-starter, very difficult to understand how and where to access one. Boats available at clubs were sometimes described as maybe not being suitable for adult female beginners. Knowing how to hire a boat is, again, as I discussed, maybe not common knowledge for everyone and maybe could be made a little bit more readily accessible. And also there was a lot of discussion around not being able to try enough boats. If women did want to invest and have the opportunity to maybe buy one, they needed more time to figure out which boat might be suitable for them, because obviously it's quite a significant commitment. Lots of women also spoke around how it's quite difficult to justify maybe buying a boat when it wasn't going to be a family activity, if it was maybe just going to be a solo activity for them. And there was also some discussions around shared ownership and sort of some of the maybe accountability issues that possibly do come with that. And there was also discussion around how you need to sometimes be a member of a club to hire a boat. So see, there was that difficulty around, having to be a member to gain access rather than maybe trial it out and then sort of see whether membership is sort of suitable for you. So some sailors did speak quite positive about rental schemes that they'd heard of, and that such schemes were really, really beneficial within some of the clubs within Northern Ireland. Again, one of these really popular discussion points that emerged was that females felt that there was pressure to engage in racing, particularly after initiatives such as taking part in Women on Water. It was often seen that things like WOW were a stepping stone into racing, and actually they felt like entry initiatives shouldn't necessarily be seen as that first stepping stone. And sort of social level sailors that were sort of fairly new to the sport felt that there could be more opportunities to sail socially for fun with sort of no sort of pressure to take part in racing. Enjoy sort of social sailing with rescue support. So again, rescue support, again, something I will come on to in a moment. Receive more support to understand where social sailing took place. So what clubs maybe have an emphasis on performance, whereas which clubs maybe have more of an emphasis on sort of social aspect and lesser sort of emphasis on the race side. So there were some good practice discussions here. And I know that one club spoke very sort of positively about how they've set up a ladies match racing group. So it's team racing, sort of one-on-one activity, sort of not designed to give people a really sort of competitive, aggressive, sort of scary experience of racing, but very much come along, learn, there are only winners and losers, but just a really sort of softer way to get back into it. So talk a little bit about that in the recommendations. So female health considerations. So quite an interesting topic, particularly when it came to the younger sailors and speaking to the parents of sort of pathway female sailors as well, was around female health. and how it perhaps isn't talked about enough within the sailing community. So some of the topics that emerged were around things like the need for female pathway sailor education on things like managing their menstrual cycle when sailing, in particular at sort of major events, when they're out on the water all day, which obviously can be sort of difficult conversations to have with young people. The need for sort of champions in Northern Ireland to maybe be sort of advocates of female health on the water, and for coaches to be sort of educated on that topic as well. More encouragement to use committee boats and motherships for sort of female health reasons. Opportunities to stop during those long days on the water. However, it was acknowledged that this is an area that has made significant progress in recent years, and there's been a huge sort of leap forward. But it's still clear that there needs to be further education, understanding, and sort of voices that maybe champion the topic. There was also discussion around is there advice for females that are pregnant? So should they be sailing? Should they be taking part in adaptive sailing? What are the recommendations here? So that might again be something that the governing body wants to sort of look at moving forward. But yeah, there's some really good quotes within the project that sort of talk about that and maybe explain it a little bit better from sort of the words of those younger sailors and parents as well. So visibility of females. So this was quite a big topic of conversation. Was sort of the major role that promoting female role models could do for the sport across all levels, different types of sailing and sort of different roles in the sport. So role models can really show other women and girls what's possible. They can inspire, they can motivate, really push the sport forward and sort of accelerate development. So some of the points that we discussed were around that need for promotion of women across various roles in the water. So not just promoting the sailors, but actually who's doing rescue support, who are the officials, who are the coaches, and really sort of sharing their stories and their pathways to getting involved within those areas. And the need for clarity within clubs around how females actually take these different pathways as well. Also, possibly the need for females to maybe go into schools and show young girls what's available, what's possible, where sailing can take them. And also the need to highlight the challenges and barriers that many females have to overcome and really sort of share those stories. Yeah, some aspects are difficult, but this is how we have to overcome it, and so can you. So yeah, there was a lot of discussion around female role models, and I think again this is maybe something that could be picked up and promoted more by the governing body and also by the clubs as well. So sailing without rescue, quite an interesting one, not one that I expected to really come up, but it did a couple of times. And it was sort of raised around how, for women, their fears are sometimes different to males. And that includes how many felt maybe they didn't feel very safe when they were sailing and they knew there was no rescue support available, which is often sort of only available within racing. Some women described sort of, really feeling quite put off from the idea of sort of racing without having that support in place. Obviously, that's resourceful in terms of time, maybe even expense. So, yeah, probably a consideration from that aspect. But yeah, again, one that was quite interesting that I think emerged that perhaps I didn't expect to. So big boat sailing. So throughout discussions, there seemed to be sort of this quite consistent theme emerging around the challenges on big boats, maybe compared to some others. So there was discussion around actually the difficulty in getting into bigger boat activities such as yachting, but also the environment on those boats as well. So many women spoke about, unlike other types of boat, females felt a little bit more out of place, maybe a bit more undervalued, spoken over, experienced more aggression, more shouting, physicality was obviously a barrier. So yeah, that was definitely something that emerged, and we'll discuss a little bit more in detail within the report itself. There was also discussion around how the sort of pathways into this type of sailing weren't very clear, and it's typically something you might fall into after trying other boats. So yeah, despite some of those sort of negatives, it seemed to be something a lot of women really wanted to know and understand more about. So in terms of the club environment, one topic area that did come up a couple of times was around appropriate changing facilities, and how that can actually be a barrier for women, although it might maybe on the surface not seem like it is, but it was something that was discussed quite frequently. So either lack of or quite low quality facilities mean that many women and girls feel a bit uncomfortable, have to get changed in front of people, and it can be particularly challenging, particularly when you don't grow up in a sport and you're not used to just getting changed into a wetsuit in front of other people. So certainly single-sex facilities are important to ensure sort of privacy and dignity. And it was also raised as being quite a barrier for families that have children with specific needs. So particularly those with sensory disorders, so those with autism, found it very sort of difficult and possibly traumatizing to sort of have to get changed in sort of open environments. So again, that's quite an interesting finding to emerge. Okay, so experiences of gender discrimination, an interesting topic. So as I was saying to Mary Kate at the start, have been involved in a lot of projects, women and girls, and I said possibly within sailing, it's possibly most amount of comments I've heard on this topic area before. So certainly interesting for me to be part of that and sort of understand that. So there's certainly no easy way to approach that topic around gender discrimination or sexism. It's a very difficult one to talk about. And it can often seem like males are being blamed for being the barrier, which is certainly not the case at all, but should be recognised that in some cases it is. So yeah, the topic simply really can't go unnoticed based on those high number of comments that were made during the project, from that recreational social level all the way up to the very sort of highest international level as well, regarding some of the attitudes, the comments, and the behaviours that they've experienced within sailing at some point. So obviously it's clear, as I said, that not all males hinder and create barriers. But yes, sometimes maybe their behaviours that they show and they portray can be a limitation without really even noticing sometimes. So yeah, I'd probably say this was the most discussed topic when I sort of approached the idea, what are the challenges and barriers in the sport? This was definitely the thing that was spoke about the most, which is certainly very interesting. But yeah, as you can see on the sort of list there, I won't go through them in detail. You can certainly read about them more within the report itself, but there was a lot of discussion around sort of shouting, the aggression, being spoken down to on several occasions, many activities being very male dominated, males assuming that you're not the owner of a boat because you're a female. It was spoken about this sort of prevailing culture, and even sort of comments and part panels or on committees, that women just felt a little bit demeaning. So being blocked in some cases from progression in the sport. So yeah, it's certainly something that came up a lot. And obviously it must be made clear that not all males can act in that way. But it is also important to recognise that the nature of sailing being a very physical sport means that males might have an upper hand sometimes and feel a little bit more dominant. But certainly is something that perhaps needs to be discussed as an organisation and within clubs. So yeah, there's some discussion and recommendations around that. So yeah, there's sort of some of the key barriers that emerged. There's several others in the report, particularly around club environment. So looking at things like imagery, the need for more sort of club social events for men, women, and children. There's also some discussion around how sailing sometimes doesn't meet the needs of quite specific populations. So people with sort of mobility issues and sort of autism, ADHD, and other sort of sensory disorders. The role of sailing in schools is discussed as well, and also a little bit around sort of kit and sort of clothing and how that can sometimes be a barrier for women as well. So yeah, you can read more about those in the actual report. So moving on though, I just want to just spend just a couple of minutes now touching on some of the pathway considerations. So those on a little bit more of the high spectrum, on a trajectory maybe to representing Ireland internationally. So it was recognised by the staff at RA Northern Ireland that the performance end of the sport is sort of relatively equal at junior level when it comes to males and females. Actually, probably a bit of a 50-50 split in that case. But actually, there is a drop off then when we sort of progress more to that youth level. It starts to move to around 70-30 males and females. So there's quite a lot of discussion in the report itself around the pathway and considerations for performance, which I think some of these aren't just geared at females, they also could be towards males and females as well. But just a couple of the points that emerged. Certainly one of them, the biggest one, probably discussed when I sort of spoke with younger females in a sport and their parents and the elite level sailors as well, was around sort of feeling pushed out of classes with maybe nowhere to go in the sport. What's the next pathway for them? But certainly one of the most topical discussions was within this project, and that's the issue around sort of physicality and the limits for some sailors being able to progress maybe in a specific class. So almost all of the female sailors in a survey between about the ages of 40 and 18 recognise this as probably one of the key issues that we're currently facing. So you'll see in the report there's sort of a bit more detail, but some of the things that were raised were around sort of the difficulties of capping the ages on specific classes, which seemed to be in some cases unfair and quite difficult, given that girls develop quite different pace to males and can almost always be disadvantaged from that. That transition from a laser 4.7 to the Ilka 6 was deemed to be quite challenging and create quite a big dropout for females. Sailors spoke about, losing interest in sort of progressing in the pathway at around 15, 16 years old when they couldn't see what the options there were for them moving forward. So yeah, there was a lot of discussion around this sort of space. Parents also spoke quite a lot around concerns for their sort of daughters around what their next steps in the pathway would be, since their options would be quite limited because of their weight, for example. And many spoke about feeling quite uncomfortable around sort of being told that they had to put on weight to be able to be suitable for certain classes. And sort of leading on from that, certainly there needs to be a bigger emphasis on those transition periods. So female pathway sailors felt that, making the transition between classes is quite difficult, naturally, as it is, and a greater emphasis should be placed on this when it comes to coach education. So yeah, as I said, many of them felt quite uncomfortable about being told to put on weight and put on muscle, and some females spoke around how could there be more of a focus on sort of learning better techniques and using their height and weight to their advantage. So yeah, that was certainly something that was quite heavily discussed when it came to pathways. There was also quite a bit of discussion around supporting females who trial new boats. So, in particular around exploring double-hander boats as an option earlier in a sailor's journey. So, when looking at the types of sailing that females under the age of 19 had taken part in, 100% stated they had experience of single-handed sailing, but only 57% had ever tried double-handed sailing, suggesting that many aren't exposed to that at an earlier age. So there's some sort of recommendations around how there should be days where girls and the squad can train together, try new boats, which can double up sort of that team bonding activity, supporting that sort of female community. But also trying to find other girls to sail double-hander with can be challenging, particularly if there aren't many youth female sailors at their club, and therefore maybe there could be sort of pairing clubs up to explore double-hander trial events, could be an option. So leaving Northern Ireland, last point here. So females on the more elite end of sport spoke about their experiences of having to leave Northern Ireland to study. Some had specifically chosen their university so that they could still continue to sail. However, for others, it wasn't part of the university plan at all. Since sailing is obviously a late specialisation sport, something you can come back to and sort of progress with later than some athletes in other sports. It is possible to study and then return to the sport. contrary to, for example, with table tennis, that wouldn't be something that would be possible. So I talk a bit around the recommendations around how maybe we can explore options for more elite training groups in Northern Ireland, because it was certainly spoke around how when lots of the top sailors leave to study, it does leave this gap in the pathway and training opportunities, and sort of can hinder the progression of other athletes. And also parents spoke quite a lot around their sort of lack of awareness around where their children could excel in sailing, in terms of which university would be best for them, whether that is in Ireland or whether that is in the UK or elsewhere. So yeah, they are just some of the considerations around the pathway. There were several others as well in the report itself, which we don't have time to really discuss in detail. So sort of finally on this last bit before I very, very briefly talk about recommendations. So just wanted to very briefly touch on the experience of sailors in sort of wider roles in the sport. So it was really nice to connect with women who were coaches, who had been race officers, who were volunteers, who had been on committees. Certainly from a committee perspective, actually quite a high number of women have been involved in committees, which was really good to see and hear. However, their experiences and opportunities certainly varied. So it was promising to hear that those that had experience of being sort of higher governance positions in the governing body speak very positively about the sort of gender balance and sort of male allies in those roles, which is really good. However, there was also some discussion at more local club level, how women are often sort of pushed towards aspects they feel fit maybe better with the women's roles. So maybe entertainment or social events, environmental things, such as that. Many women also just sort of describe their experiences maybe feeling maybe out of place in that committee environment. Maybe their voice wasn't heard. They felt their comments were sometimes shut out quickly or sort of brushed under the carpet. But certainly, younger females should be encouraged to have a voice within clubs at younger age, and should be encouraged to join committees and really be listened to as well. So there is a lot more discussion about that in the report. Race officiating. So when asked to outline future aspirations in the sport, there's a quite high number of women and girls expressing interest in sort of taking that race officer pathway, which is really positive to see. So those females that had been involved in race officiating, predominantly had positive experiences, which was really good. Outlining how they've been supported by males to progress and sort of understand that's a pathway and where they needed to go. However, one of the common areas, particularly for the younger sailors, was that they weren't aware of how to get into race officiating, what the commitments were. And yeah, from the stats from the survey, it's clear that the slightly older population may be involved in this area and could be progressed. The younger population may be a sort of pathway out of that youth level, for example. So just conscious of time, I'm going to go to the recommendations and briefly give you an overview of some of the things I've outlined. So what you'll see is 11 main recommendations consider for Northern Ireland's sailing. So these are mainly the big impact ones that I felt could, have quite a large impact if they were implemented. What you'll also see is a couple of additional recommendations as well, which maybe still have a big impact, but maybe not quite as big as what I deemed the others to be. So these are framed as questions. So whenever I do a report or project, I don't like to tell people this is what they should be doing and this is how they should do it. I think they should be phrased as questions because they allow for a little more reflection and thought. And obviously there's things like, finances and sort of time, resource to consider. And obviously every organisation has priorities they need to consider as well, and sort of type deadlines to meet. So yeah, really help hopefully to encourage questions and reflection on the governing body's part. So just to very quickly skip over these, you'll be able to read about them more in the report itself. So the first one is around whether the Women and Water should actually have this stage 2 element. So the feedback on the WOW programme was that it was excellent, insightful, it was inspiring. However, the main topic that kept emerging is that it's often too short maybe there wasn't enough legacy program and just an introduction to sailing, which is understandably the aim. However, many of the women spoke about how they needed longer to develop confidence on the water. So some of the things, it's often described as a gateway into sailing, but some of the considerations moving forward might be around extending the introductory element, maybe lengthening the program, supporting women to create their path post-WOW. What does that look like? How can they be involved? Considering things like reduced boat hire fees, perhaps for those who've taken part in the program. Yeah, really try and think of some of those perks and what they could be. And I also recommend whether the program could be actually categorized more into different strands. So clearly it's a very good brand. However, many women who already had significant experience within sailing suggested that they wanted to get back into the sport, but they didn't feel that the WOW program was maybe the best way to do that. And so I suggest lots of different categories around maybe a WOW refresh program, a WOW support program designed for those in sort of wider sort of sailing roles, maybe a WOW teenager brand, obviously with that bigger social element with the young ones, WOW skills, so maybe around developing some of the specific skills that the women spoke about, wanting to learn more about in the project. So the first one was around whether clubs could deliver more no pressure race opportunities. So as I spoke about before, many women that took part said they had quite negative experiences of mixed fleet sailing and weren't always interested in the real sort of competitive sailing and actually a good sort of middle ground. Clubs to run that no pressure sailing, such as the Ladies at Launch initiative, could be quite beneficial. Could perhaps even culminate in a bit of a Ladies at Launch league. Next one is around whether there could be more to promote female role models in the sport. So I spoke about this quite a lot before, but could there be a bit of like a WOW highlight series on social media to promote some of those key figures that are doing various different aspects of the sport? I also spoke about maybe a bit of initiative to inspire more women into sailing support roles. So into aspects such as rescue, into race officiating, into coaching, and really highlighting some maybe pathway case studies of sailors who have taken these routes and, making more information accessible about careers in sailing as well. The next one is around whether Norway Northern Ireland could build that elite training squad, which I spoke about a little bit before. So actually, maybe obviously there are limitations here because there aren't many universities within Northern Ireland, but could a sort of elite base be built close or around one and actually sort of progressively year on year build that women's programme? I also talk about whether there could be more to promote and voice the need for attitude changes across that sailing community. So could they consider maybe a call it out campaign or a male ally campaign that really promotes those positive behaviours that males can play and to support females in the sport? There's also discussion around the role that clubs can have in terms of representatives for females in committees and sort of governance. So really sort of highlighting the impact of the female voice and the positive role it can play. Women and girls committees in clubs, supporting every club to have female champions and support more women to undertake committee training. So really enhance those training opportunities for women to step into those roles. There's also recommendations around boat loaning schemes and sort of some options that could be considered here to make it slightly more accessible for those who aren't members of clubs or don't know what type of boat they're interested in buying. I also talk about developing a female health campaign and really having some positive role models and champions to really push this area. And sort of finally, there are some recommendations around pathway and actually for maybe governing body to work out what their priorities are and what role they can play in influencing clubs to support types of Olympic sailing, for example. Could they work more closely with specific clubs to become performance-based clubs and be sort of a hub for those sort of high-level pathway sailors? So yeah, there are just some considerations that I put forward. Obviously, I haven't had time to talk about those in detail, but you can read more about those within the report itself. There's also, as I said, a whole list of other questions to consider, and lots of these could be taken from the club's perspective as well. So, obviously I phrase it that it's from could RYA Northern Ireland consider X, Y, and Z, but really I think it's important that maybe the clubs also look through all these recommendations to think actually what are the little nuggets that we can take and we can do differently to really support female participation. So yeah, I'm not going to go through these. Obviously, the report will be available, so please do read these when you do have access to it. But yeah, that's the end of my sort of discussion this evening. Obviously, I know I've talked a lot at you. If anyone does have any questions, I am happy to answer them, or if you want to email me them afterwards, I'm also happy to answer them. But yeah, as I said, I believe the report is going to be made available, so you should be able to read over it and sort of understand some of the things I spoke about in a bit more detail, and maybe understand the context of them a bit more when you can read the full quotes. But yeah, that is the end of my talk. So I will pass back to Mary or Kate. But yeah, thanks so much for having me, and hopefully it's been insightful, and it's a really, really good project to be involved in.
Thanks very much, Emma. That was really good. Definitely a big report to digest. We're hoping to have this out tomorrow live on our website. So hopefully, all being well, we'll be able to get that published and we can share it with all the clubs as well to have a read. Does anyone have any questions for us just while we're here?
Kate, can I just say something here?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? I just want to say thank you to Emma. That's a really interesting piece of work, and there's certainly, I think, if I'm speaking on behalf of the board, there's an awful lot of work there for us to get our teeth into, and certainly very interesting way to take things forward. So thank you very much. It's been a certainly amazing piece of work to go through, and I think the response that you've had has been really good and encouraging. So we're looking forward to taking it further forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. No, I look forward to maybe staying in touch and seeing how things progress as well. So yeah, thank you.
If no one has any questions, then I'm happy for us to wrap up. But again, I hope everyone took away something from this, and there's so much to dive into. Like, I'm excited for us for future projects to really get this nailed down and implement all this work, because it will make such a difference. So thank you so much for all of your hard work.
No
Really
worries.
good question. I can't believe it.
Well, again, if people do have questions, just drop us an email, or like Emma says, drop her an email as well. We're here anytime you need. So
We in the office, it was easy to read in terms of how you set it out, Emma, but not easy to read because of some of the content in there. And it even within the office create quite a bit of debate about some of the things that were in there that are so opposite from how we have always done things. So if you're on the call thinking some of that's crazy, please talk to us now. This is a good chance to get the ball rolling on the debate. See some male allies in this in this call tonight. Thank you, especially to you.
absolutely.
Thank you.
I always have loads of questions, but I'm not getting involved at the moment. Sorry, I did miss some of it because I was on nighttime duty.
Lisa, you'll be back and you'll be bringing like a full book with you full of questions. Day one. Oh, Heather, do you have a question?
It'll be, how do I turn my laptop on?
Yeah, forgive me for maybe asking a very stupid question. But Emma, when I looked at your first slide and you had the number of 100 participants, and then you did a number of interviews, you only ever interviewed one person. Was that down to time restraints, or was that down to just there weren't the people to ask? Or I'm just wondering.
Yeah, so there was I think primarily there was 5 focus groups. So within those focus groups there was sort of sometimes about 3 to 5, 6 people. And then also there was a series of interviews. So that was sometimes when someone couldn't make a focus group, for example. I felt they were quite important to follow up with them. So I did also a couple of individual interviews as well. So I think overall there was probably maybe, obviously the 100 people that took part in a survey, but actually people that I spoke to, there was probably maybe about 30 to 35 probably.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Emma.
Patrick, you unmuted yourself. Have you got a question or any feeling about the?
Yeah, I was a bit wary about being the only man getting involved. In some ways, it feels like you should, in some ways, I shouldn't be talking. But I just want to say the report was obviously excellent. I really enjoyed it and thought it was really useful. But so much of what you've put forward makes common sense to the whole club. Doesn't matter if it's female, male, kids, men, women, whatever. So it's a useful tool, I think, for clubs in general, rather than just simply being for women only. I think we've put into place some of these things, we will have a better club all around. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Patrick.
I thought that about some of the comments too, and across sailing, the clubs with the most equal membership are usually our sailability clubs, and that's we think that's in part because of the environment, the wording, the way the club is set up in terms of hiring boats and what have you, all of that. It just makes sense across the board.
It looks like Lisa's raised her hand again.
Yeah,
Maybe
sorry.
it was a dog.
Emma, see, I missed halfway through it. See, with regards to some of the comments about the developing the women on water and things like that, can you connect those comments to the type of people that completed the survey? As in, can then clubs connect their members to the type of program that would suit them better?
Yeah, so when you see the report, what you'll see is with all the quotes, it tells you who said it, and not the exact person, but their, whether they're sort of a recreational level or whether they are a national level sailor, whether they're a coach. So hopefully that will maybe help to make some of those connections in terms of who's actually saying those comments.
Okay, thank you.
Heather.
Sorry, it's me again. Emma, I just thought I'd say, coming from a sporting background myself, not necessarily sailing, it is very refreshing to find from your results that it's one of the few sports that people stay engaged in at a high level to a much older age. And as a PE teacher, I think that's brilliant. And I think that is perhaps a great strength that is unique to sailing. So from that point of view, along obviously with all the other research, that it's wonderful that you have unveiled that. So that's maybe thoughts for future as well for the RYA, who knows, but maybe you guys know that's just new to me, but thank you for revealing that. Thanks.
No worries. Yeah, really interested in finding it. As I said, in my sport in table tennis, it's completely the opposite. So yeah, it was really interesting actually. So yeah, no, thank you.
See some, I would love to have more discussion about this. So obviously if this isn't the place, then please do give us a call and chat about it. Especially I see some big boat racing ladies and indeed helms on the call. So I'd love to talk to you about your experience and how you stuck at it as it were, and as potentially role models that we could talk about in our press and stuff. Looking at you, Fiona.
Should I respond to that?
Please do.
Well, for those who don't know me, I spent my entire life sailing. About 12 or 13 years ago, I took up golf. And the relevance of that is that golf has been going through a bit of a rebranding. First of all, we have an All Ireland, one governing body for the whole island of Ireland. And it's one gender. It used to be two, a men's and a women's golf union. It's all one now. And there have been great strides being taken to make the game as gender balanced as possible. There's a lot of drive on gender balance on committees and overall in governance. And it seems to me we're also driving to get younger people into the sport and to keep them. I mean, recruiting and retention is a big thing. And I mean, I'm involved in running a Get Into Golf for Girls at the moment at Donaghadee, and with the aim to try and increase that. But it seems to me that these things come from two directions. In order to increase the number of females in governance throughout a club, different committees, you need to get them in at the bottom and show them the pathway. But from the other end, you need more women at the top already, or men who are minded the right way to drive that. And I mean, I think certainly, and the number of local golf clubs around Bangor, North Down, I know that is happening slowly but surely. Golf Ireland have a policy which they actually are going to enforce, probably, or they want to enforce, is that all committees in clubs should be at least, oh God, I think it's 40-40, yeah, or 30-30-40, something like that. It must be at least 30% female, at least 30% male, and 40 everybody else. It always makes me laugh. You know, are they bringing in the third gender? But the idea is to have at least 30% male and 30% female on every committee. And the one interesting thing they do have, which you can always look up on the Golf Ireland website, golfireland.ie, is they brought in a few years ago the Women in Golf Charter, which clubs signed up to this with various aims, gold, silver and bronze. And the idea being, the key ideas were to raise visibility of women in the sport, to encourage volunteering, to show women that there was a pathway and that volunteering wasn't just being the secretary on the social committee. That drives me mad. Will you come on my committee? Oh yes, thanks. Will you be the secretary? No, sorry, I'm nobody's secretary. You know, it's that assumption that you mentioned about assuming that females will do certain jobs. But the whole idea is to raise the visibility, increase the participation, and to get you know, and at Donaghadee we are doing more mixed events, more mixed open events and this sort of thing, which is helping. So that's really what I think. I've been on committees at Royal Ulster for years. I'm not at I'm on the sailing committee at the moment. But the one other thing that, sorry, I'll try and finish this now, is the fact that women tend to want to be asked to be involved, whereas men just assume that they can be involved. Women tend to think that they need to be 100%, meet 100% of criteria to do a particular volunteering job. Men think if they're about 30%, they can do it anyway and just wing the rest. And the other problem is that men on committees, and particularly the main general committee, council, whatever you call it, tend to choose their friends to follow on from them. So it perpetrates this male dominance. And that is a big problem in a lot of places, particularly you get in the golf club, where the captain of a golf club tends to choose his chum to be his vice captain and follow regardless of skills or suitability, you know. And it does happen in yacht clubs as well, I'm sure. Royal Ulster's a bit strange compared to others because we're, you know, we don't have dinghies sailing outside the door and that sort of thing. But sorry, so I went on a bit, but that's my views on it from a completely different point of view.
No, that's brilliant. We've also talked about how, although the comment in the the research says most boats are owned by men, and so they invite their friends to come sailing with them. And you know, so it's similar to the committee. They invite the next guy to come sailing rather than a female who might be much more skilled, etc. Anyway,
it used to drive me mad years ago when I first got into offshore sailing, that I would go on a boat with a bunch of men who were just picked off the rugby front row, who knew absolutely nothing. And you sort of think, I mean, I was told on one occasion to hide down below at the start of a race so as their wives wouldn't see there was a woman on board. Things have come on a bit since then. But it used to drive me mad because I knew what I was doing. And these big guys were only there for pulling ropes and things, and they were a bit of a menace, really. I know. I'll shut up now.
excellent. Thank you, Fiona. It was all really valid, and we have connected with Gulf at governing body level, you know, different things. But anyway, thank you.
Hi there, Mary. It's Betty Armstrong here.
Hi, Betty.
My camera won't work, so maybe just as well.
We'll forgive you.
Pardon? Pardon?
We'll forgive you that.
Oh, that's okay. And anyhow, could I endorse everything that Fiona has said? She's a chum of mine, and I know exactly how she thinks. She probably doesn't know I do, but I think I do. Anyway, the comparison with golf is interesting because if I remember correctly, I used to work for RYANI way back in the late 60s when they had an office on the Malone Road. And if I remember, you could maybe check this, but if I remember correctly, it was started there as a branch of the Irish Yacht Association.
That's correct.
It was then. And then it became very Northern Ireland centred and became RYANI. Ben Dickinson and Jerry Leonard, I think, were at the top at that stage. But it only occurred to me quite recently, after all these years, that it may have been the start of the troubles that forced the separation. I don't know, maybe there's somebody as old as me in the RYA who could tell me that, but I was just thinking what Fiona said about Gulf Ireland being in two separate sections, and now it's one. I just wondered, you know, that comparison stuck out at.
The first chair of RYANI, Bell, if I'm right.
Yeah.
So you might know Maeve and you could ask her.
Yeah, well, I used to work to her.
Yes.
When I did publicity for RYA many years later. But I will ask her because it seems that sailing and golf have gone in different directions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Jennifer.
No, I just had a thought, I suppose. See the women on the water. I suppose I picking up on what Emma was saying on sort of like nearly a phase 2 or how do you progress that? I suppose what I'd be interested in seeing is I've never thought that was something for me because I'm already a sailor who's established, I'm at a club, but it'd be interesting to sort of touch on that kind of community of like women coming together from different sailing backgrounds and having that opportunity, whether it's to a series round clubs where they can pop into different women on the water events that are maybe aimed at new sailors, but also existing women sailors as well. So just I suppose something that I was thinking of would be quite nice to maybe progress or have an opportunity to be a part of.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that's definitely something that we have discussed quite a lot since the research came out as a team, because I think with my new role and working with Lisa and Mary and Hammy as well, you know, diving into the different sectors of upskilling, whether it's coaching or whether you want to go down a bit of team racing or keel boating or dinghy, or maybe you want to do a bit more volunteering in power boating, you know, whatever that looks like. It's definitely something that we have thought about in terms of next steps for whether it's called Women on Water or whether it's something else. Yeah, definitely 100%. Thank you. Waiting for someone to jump on. Anyone else eager?
Nobody seems surprised by the findings.
I know.
Nobody's arguing that they're wrong, which is interesting as well. Definitely lots for us to work on.
Yeah.
Hi, Marion, Kate, Rachel Nixon here.
Hi, Rachel.
I just think that there's some really interesting stuff in the report, and I would probably say most of the stuff I wasn't particularly surprised about. Maybe some of the percentages more surprised at. My background within sailing is that my kids sail, and also in the Women on Water programme. One of the really exciting things I would say is that it was touched on briefly, the teenagers and sailing. All my kids are involved in sailing, and many other people, when I post on Facebook, would ever say, my goodness, that's brilliant. How did your kids get involved in that? And they all did from an early stage. And I think that's a huge gap that we as clubs and females in particular, how female teenagers could start sailing at the moment. Certainly in Donaghadee and Ballyholme, the two clubs that I'm involved in, it would be quite difficult for a teenager just to start sailing. You don't want them to go an RYA level 1 course where the majority of children are either 6, 8, 10 at the most. So I think there's some really exciting opportunities there for the clubs as well, and maybe just for the RYA to work with the clubs and find out how can we capture this brand new group of people as well. And because that will help us with the other things in terms of the future generations and getting them involved at that teenage stage and keeping them involved and retaining them, which, as we know, is a big challenge. So really, really good and really exciting stuff, Emma. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Rachel, I'm smiling because I've had this conversation with my dad, which you can imagine how that went.
I can indeed, but we'll both corner him maybe one day, and he could be our teenage Women on Water champion. And
yes.
If he was, I know it will be a great success. And if we win him over, we're sorted.
Yeah, yeah.
But I beat him into it.
Yeah, you're
Yes. In a room with me. As an SI on a course with a teenager and loads of 8-year-olds, it's you know, you can feel their discomfort and dismay at being in that group as a learner.
Absolutely. And the flip side of that is if you had 10 teenage girls, you would have other challenges. 2 in our house is enough. But there is definitely it would be need to be led in a very different way, but just could be brilliant, just could be really, really good. And in terms of having and creating a junior committee structure as the norm across clubs, rather than just where there are large groups of kids at different stages. So yeah, really exciting.
cool.
I wanted to, one of the things that we didn't survey anybody under 16, isn't that right?
It was 15 plus. 15 plus.
Yeah. So we're saying we have the most equality as in that under 16. So I think that could be in your mind as well when you're thinking of that population. But anyway, thank you very much. It's been hard, but it will be. I know we will use it so much over the next couple of years.
Good. No, I'm pleased. Thank you for inviting me to be part of it. Really enjoyed it.
Okay. Night night, everybody.
Perfect. Thanks very much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Good night.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.